Good afternoon and welcome to Democracy in the 2024 election. I'm Matt Hall. I'm a professor in the Political Science Department and the director of the Bruni Center for the Study of American Democracy. Back in grad school, I discovered that my job comes with an unusual occupational hazard. Anytime a stranger asks what I do, if I decide to tell the truth, I find myself in a conversation about politics with a total stranger. And these conversations always kind of go the same way. Everyone starts with, oh, this is such an interesting time to be studying politics. What with everything crazy going on? They do this, by the way, every single year, regardless of what's going on. It doesn't matter. And I feel the need to explain to them most of the time, no, this is actually not particularly unusual. Despite what you might have heard on cable news, the world is not coming to an end. This is not the craziest time ever in American politics. And the next random midterm election is not the most important election in American history. Every time I have this conversation, I can't help but think of Robert Kennedy's speech a few years before he was assassinated, in which he related an old Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times, and really lamented the fact that the 1960s, they were living through one of those interesting times. Kennedy actually ripped that off from another politician, Austin Chamberlain, who in the years leading up to World War II said that they were under that same curse, living in interesting times. Turns out the whole Chinese curse thing is completely apocryphal. No such thing in China. It actually can be traced back to that British politician's own father, who in the 1890s gave a speech describing that period as interesting times in which each new day brings new objects of interest and new objects of anxiety. It's been 130 years, and man, can I relate to that. In objects of anxiety. In an era where we're experiencing intense partisan polarization, widespread disinformation, shocking acts of political violence, and even attempted political assassinations, I'm sorry to report we are indeed living in interesting times. But have no fear, because there's a panel to help alleviate our collective level of anxiety with a series of experts in these interesting times. We're joined today by Pulitzer Prize winner and New York Times columnist Carlos Lozada, former editor-in-chief and current editor-at-large for the Wall Street Journal, Gerard Baker, the Reverend, I messed up your title, the distinguished Professor Reverend C.S.C. Lewis, distinguished professor of political science, Dianne Pinderhughes, and the namesake of the Bruni Center, former congressman and ambassador to the Holy See, Francis Rooney. And of course, our moderator, Dean Cole of the law school. So please join me in welcoming our panel.
Thank you very much for the introductions, Matt, and I'm grateful to be here to put questions to our panel about American democracy and the 2024 election. And I want to start by suggesting that Americans have probably learned more about the Electoral College over the last 4 years than they ever learned in school. And so now we're in a situation where states are solidly red or solidly blue. And the election of the President of the United States really comes down to just 7 swing states. And in fact, I don't think it's outlandish to suggest that the people of Pennsylvania will be electing the President of the United States this year. What do we do about this? Should we revisit campaign finance law so that people living in California who basically their votes don't really count if California is not in play, should they be allowed to give beyond the limits to candidates running in Pennsylvania? I'll put it to any, Carlos.
Sure. Any of you? Me? Okay. First of all, thank you for having me, for having all of us here. I understand and applaud the impetus behind the question. Anything that allows for enhanced participation in the democratic system, especially the electoral system, I think is vital. I'd be somewhat hesitant about that particular approach to it. I think it might be something that addresses symptoms more than causes, right? If you're worried about voters in other states that are not Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, North Carolina, Georgia, Arizona, Nevada, right, the 7, being disenfranchised, then maybe we do something about that, rather than allowing people to inject more money into those same states, right? I suspect that it might sort of aggravate the problem. If the Electoral College is the issue, if the way we elect senators is the issue, then I think let's explore those questions. The voters, I don't know, actually necessarily want to have more money in politics. Pew has done some research on this, and they find that a majority of voters think there's too much money in politics. They actually want there to be less money in politics. And so if we want to be responsive to voters, we might be responsive to that sort of impulse on their part as well. The last thing, and here I hesitate speaking in front of a law school dean, but the Supreme Court, it seems to me, has done plenty to allow for additional money in politics, not just the Citizens United case, but more recently the McCutcheon case, which removed limits on aggregate contributions. And so it seems even with those changes, we still face the issue, the challenge that you started.
So let me ask you, Jared, do you think that the Electoral College, as Carlos mentioned, is the thing that's disenfranchising people in the 43 states that are not?
Thank you, Dean Cole. Thank you very much indeed for the invitation to be here. It's always a pleasure for me to be here. You can tell from my accent I'm not from these parts. Although I have lived in the United States for more than 30 years now, and I love coming to Notre Dame. My principal connection here is that I have 5 daughters, 3 of whom graduated from Notre Dame, one of whom is currently a sophomore. She did promise to be here this afternoon, but apparently Friday afternoon, football weekend, she had better things to do. Who knew? But I think I agree with Carlos. I think doing anything that actually further facilitates the infusion of large amounts of money into US elections is probably not a good thing. And the Electoral College, look, the Electoral, as you say, Dean, the Electoral College has become controversial in the last few years. I was in Florida in 2020 when we had the extraordinary Bush v. Gore runoff after the election, as it were, which went on for 5 weeks. Of course, that was what was so striking about that election. Of course, remember that was Gore won slightly more of the popular vote than Bush, and thanks to a 500 margin vote in Florida, Bush won the election. And everybody at the time was thinking, my God, this is a freak. We never have elections like this again. So close, and where one candidate wins the popular vote but loses the Electoral College. Well, I would say, dare to say, with so much of American life, the freak has become the norm. Now we have these extraordinarily close elections, time after time after time, which create not only political dissatisfaction, but obviously legal questions and challenges. I was reading recently about Nikita Khrushchev, who was the leader of the Soviet Union, who became General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union after Joseph Stalin, after a power struggle after Joseph Stalin, some of which, if you haven't seen the Death of Stalin movie, I advise you to look at it to give you a little bit of a taste of what went on. Khrushchev was leader of the Soviet Union for 10 years, almost 10 years, and in the context of talking about the differences between Western democracy and Soviet democracy, as they called it, he said, the real problem with free elections that you have is that nobody knows who's going to win them. And as I was reading that, I was struck and I thought, actually, no, you know what, America has actually taken that a stage further now, because not only in this country do we not know who's going to win an election before it's taken place, we don't actually know who's won an election after it's happened. So look, I think I do understand the concerns about the Electoral College, and by the way, if we get another election, this would be, it is remarkable. If Trump would win in November, it would be, I think that's right, it would be and not win the popular vote. If he won the Electoral College and not the popular vote, it would be the 6th time in 7 elections that Democrats have won the popular vote. And it will be the 3rd time, third out of 3 of those occasions when they've been beaten in the Electoral College. So I do understand the concerns about, look, but what I would say, there are a number of reforms you could make. You could make the allocation of votes in the Electoral College by each state proportionate to the state's votes. You could do what 2 states currently do, which is to divide the electoral vote up by congressional districts. There are reforms you can make if you want to. The only thing I'd say in defence of the Electoral College, and it is becoming harder and harder to defend, I think, for a lot of people, is, look, it was set up, we can argue about the reasons it was set up, but it does reflect the federalism of the United States. The founders were very keen to ensure that this was not a single unitary polity, but that it had reflected the various cultures, political cultures and characters, and indeed the autonomy of the various constituent states. And that is why that's why the Electoral College is formed as it is, with that, obviously because of it's tied to the representation in Congress, it significantly overrepresents small states and underrepresents the larger states. So I think there is something about, while I understand the concerns about the Electoral College, there is something still, I think, it's worth reflecting on what makes many of the things that have made America so successful and so stable for 240 years. And I think one of those things is the federalist system, is the fact, again, I come from Britain where there is no federalism. Britain's a whole unitary state and it's created its own problems as a result. So I think if you were going to, I think you should reflect on the advantages that the Electoral College represents, as well as the demerits of it.
Professor Dianne Pinderhughes, is the Electoral College the problem?
Well, there are a lot of problems. I guess I would say that your initial question about should we invite the issue of campaign contribution limits to enable Americans to get more involved in elections. My first reaction to that, your question, was yes, but tell that to the Supreme Court. The court has not been willing to put any constraints on spending. So that's one element. The Electoral College is a problem in the sense that the overrepresentation is, as Jerry just mentioned, which means that the representation of the millions of people in California is ignored. And the representation in many other larger states that include more representation by people of color, by African Americans, by New York, California, the southern states, tend not to get represented in the same way that they might if the representation was proportional. So the Electoral College creates a system of power that advantages the smallest portions of the population.
So, but I think the response to that might be that 1 out of every 9 Americans is a Californian, and if we eliminated the Electoral College, we'd all be Californians. California, right?
As opposed to by Pennsylvania?
Ambassador Rooney, so you served in Congress. What are your thoughts about the role of the Electoral College in these elections?
I think the Electoral College is doing exactly what the founders set it up to do. And I think it's important in our separation of powers and our system of protecting the big from the small from the big, that we allow it to function the way that it is. Otherwise, you're going to have California, Chicago, and New York elect everybody. And I don't think American people deserve that. And I don't think that stands for either. With that said, on campaign finance, I have some time invested in that, and it is absolutely a problem. When I was on George Bush's finance team with another gentleman in this room, our budget in 2004 was $164 million. Well, it's in the paper this week that both Ohio and Pennsylvania, Ohio and Michigan are going to spend almost $300 million in their Senate campaign. And Dave McCormick told me that he expects them to spend $400 between him and Casey in Pennsylvania. So something's dreadfully wrong. And it's empowering a bunch of lobbyists and special interest people who exert an inordinate amount of influence on many of our legislators. And that's a real problem in and of itself. The other problem is non-disclosed contributions. You may not know this, but there's a section in the election law which allows you to give to a certain kind of PAC and not disclose what you gave. And I would be absolutely against that.
So you mentioned legislative legislators, I'm going to talk a little bit about state legislatures. And right now, I think we're witnessing in various states that are heavily one party or the other moves to affect the election process. So, for example, in Georgia, we're seeing moves by a Republican legislature and a Republican governor to enact election law reforms that are arguably intended to suppress the vote, or some would argue that they're intended to make the vote more honest, to keep non-citizens from voting. Professor Pinderhughes, what do you think about these measures, and are they likely to succeed for Republicans, or has the influx of Northerners into southern states been so great that it overwhelms that move?
Well, there are a couple of bits of information I can share that, for example, in 2021, the Republican voting law changes put in place to limit black voters, and some examples: limit the ability of the state election board and Secretary of State to enter into certain consent agreements, settlements, and consent orders. The Secretary of State shall be a non-voting ex officio member of the state election board, which in the past the Secretary of State had been a voting member. Revises provisions related to the quorum of such a board to require the Secretary of State to support and assist the state election board. A whole variety of things that have been intended to constrain the ability of election officials to operate in a nonpartisan fashion. Now that's 2021. There have been a number of other actions that have been taken since then that are even more aggressive to limit state election officials' abilities to protect the rights of people to vote. Whether or not the migration to the south from the north will make enough of a difference, people like Stacey Abrams' ability to create a number of voting rights organizations, whether she will be able to have an impact, whether the large number of black voters who have been migrating to the south will make a difference and will be able to counter some of these laws, is a very important question. I would guess that the effort of the Republican Party to, given the Republican governor, given the Republican election officials, to put constraints on those black voters, particularly black voters, but the black voters who are Democratic voters as well, will, I mean, that's a question for me. I think that there's some, I'd like to think there's some possibility that they'll be able to resist, but they've been working very hard at putting in restraints on the ability of voters to actually participate in a regular way. One example is the not giving voters water when they're standing in line, and Georgia has been known to be a state that voter registration, voter participation tends to produce very long times that people have to wait to vote. And we don't see that in many other states. So it's a question. I think it's a problem.
Is there a legitimate reason why these measures are being put in place? Is there an argument, Gerard?
Yeah, I mean, yes, there is. And I'll push back a little bit on what Professor says. I mean, for example, although those Georgia voting law changes that were made in 2021 were described by Democrats as, you know, Jim Crow 2.0 and an effort to suppress black voting, it was striking that in the 2022 midterms, the first elections that took place under the new rules, the turnout was significantly higher, including among black voters. It was higher than it had ever, it was actually the highest I think it had ever been in a midterm election. Black voters voted in larger numbers than they voted in the previous midterm elections in 2018, 2014, depending on when the Senate race was. And of course, the African-American Democratic candidate won. Again, won actually by a slightly larger share of the vote than he won in 2020, when there was a special election for the same seat. So And there are concerns about fraudulent registration, about voters being registered who are not residents. There were limited numbers of cases of that. As we know, Donald Trump made a big deal of it in Georgia about after the 2020 election. There was no significant evidence of widespread fraud. But I do think tightening some of the rules around voting, particularly around things like early voting, to minimise the risk of fraud. It's what, by the way, happens in almost every other country. Other countries do have rules about producing identity when you go to vote. You have certain, much more limited time frames in which to vote. In the 2020 election, or even in this election, as we know, early voting has already started. Mail-in balloting, which has become very, very widespread here, is notoriously susceptible to fraud. So I think actually there is a case for significantly tightening the rules around voting, particularly in an age which we just talked about, when there is so much controversy and so much doubt about the legitimacy of elections. And if you can do what you can do to make sure that people see that these elections are conducted legitimately, then you are going to limit the ability of people, when Donald Trump comes out and tries to say, actually, there was fraudulent voting. If you've taken very tough measures against fraudulent voting, you have a better chance, I think, of securing a higher level of confidence in the vote.
Carlos, do we have large measures of fraudulent voting across the United States?
I don't think that we do. I don't think that we've determined that. I always find it interesting when politicians say that they're merely responding to widespread concerns, when in fact they've often fostered those widespread concerns to begin with. And so that is something that you've seen in recent years. In Georgia, what you're seeing is not just legislative sort of change, laws taken up by the legislature. You're seeing the state election board much more recently introducing rules to the conduct of the election. For instance, and this is just in the last few weeks, the state election board in Georgia is now requiring county-level officials to do a manual count of all votes, not just the machine count. And that could delay the reporting of the results by several days. And if three independent poll workers don't produce the exact same count, then there has to be a sort of continuous recount. At the same time, they've allowed counties, county-level officials, to delay certification if they have cause to suspect irregularities. And of course, the uncertainties you're creating by introducing the manual count can create those concerns about irregularities. And coincidentally, 3 of the 5 officials are being on the State Board of Elections, sorry for all this detail, are being sort of name-checked by one of the major presidential candidates in his rallies, right? And so, those kind of things can foster in turn the kind of uncertainty that politicians say they're merely responding to, when often they are fostering.
Ambassador Rooney, are we responding to a myth of widespread fraud, or is this a reality?
I have not seen, as the gentleman just said, any documentable, verifiable evidence of massive or widespread fraud. There's always a few in every state, bad ballots that aren't signed, et cetera, et cetera. But the issues that have been touched on here in Georgia are important for the whole United States. This business of hand counting ballots in the electronic age, delaying the completion of the process for as much as a week makes 0 sense to me. And I think it's going to create more uncertainty in the middle of a climate where uncertainty is not our friend. Stability and certainty are our friend. Now, I don't have any problem with ID to vote. All around the world, you have to have an ID to vote. In Mexico, they've got a picture of you there, and you go up, they compare you to it, and you sign right under it, and your ID number has to match what they've got in their book. In Iraq, as you've probably seen on TV, they put the ink on your thumb and won't go away from things. But we can make sure that the people that should vote get to vote. That's all you got to do.
Both Jerry and Dianne mentioned the black vote in Georgia, and by all reports, the black vote will be critically important in determining the outcome in Georgia. Are there other states where the black vote is going to make a difference in determining the outcome? Or are we just talking about Georgia and maybe North Carolina?
I mean, in a close election, obviously Georgia's, I think, the large of the 7 swing states, I think, does have the largest proportion of black voters. But in a close election, I mean, yes, the turnout in any group will matter. You know, the last elections, as you know, the last 2 elections were decided by, if 35,000 people in 3 or 4 states, I think it was in 2016, had voted for Hillary Clinton rather than Donald Trump, she would have won out of a total of 135 million votes cast. In 2020, 20,000 people had voted for Donald Trump rather than Joe Biden in just 3 states. He would have won out of 160 million cast. So these are the margins we're talking about. And if you look at the polling in the swing states insofar as it can be trusted, every single swing state, every one of those 7 key states that everybody's focused on, the margin is between 0.1 in favour of one candidate and 2.1 in favour of another candidate. So, yeah, well, Georgia, as I say, I think has the largest number of black voters in one of those states, but I would think in North Carolina will be quite significant. The northern states tend to have got fewer, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, fewer black voters, but it could, you know, these, when you have an election decided by a few thousand votes potentially in a few states, then every single facet of turnout, of electoral behaviour is potentially determinative.
Let me ask about another swing state, Arizona. So, in Arizona, recently the state Supreme Court revived the enforceability of an 1864 abortion law that banned virtually all abortions. And that decision was met with an effort by the state legislature to overturn or repeal that law, as well as an effort to defeat 2 of the Supreme Court justices in a retention election. What role will the abortion debate play in Arizona? Carlos?
There's an interesting contrast there. Since the Dobbs ruling 2 years ago, you've seen state-level measures in support of abortion rights having a lot of success, even in states that you might otherwise think would lean more conservative, such as Kansas. And Arizona now has one which would enshrine sort of row-level protections for abortion rights moving forward. Yet Trump is up like 5 points or so in Arizona, depending on polls. Sometimes it's a little more narrow in others. When you look at the New York Times, sorry to be so parochial, at the New York Times Siena poll of swing states, you see that abortion rights are considered the top issue for about 18% of voters in Arizona. Below the economy, below the border, right? And so that may be part of the, that may help square that circle. What seems clear is that both presidential campaigns seem to have a similar theory of the case, right? It's a winning issue for Democrats, it's a losing issue for Republicans. And you see that because Kamala Harris is campaigning very actively on it, talking about codifying Roe, whereas Donald Trump is doing this sort of odd thing where he's doing these very kind of direct appeals to women, saying, you know, your life's going to be so great, it'll be so safe, prices will be low, you won't even think about abortion anymore, don't worry. And so, the irony of that, of course, is that it took the Democrats losing on the big issue, right, Roe, to make it a winning electoral issue. And it took the Republicans winning on the big issue, Dobbs, to make it a political weight on them.
Are there other swing states where abortion is going to make a difference in this outcome?
Wherever there's the question of what are the most important issues, abortion may not be the top issue, but when it's referred to, for example, in North Carolina, when asked if people thought it should be mostly legal or somewhat legal, in North Carolina, for example, 63% of voters said yes, it should be. And in fact, all of those swing states, it ends up with abortion is at that level, 63% or so, around that level. So North Carolina, Arizona, and Georgia, they all have the same response. So
Is that enough to, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but is that enough to swing, I mean, are voters voting on that?
That's a fair question. That's not the most, they don't list that as the most important issue, but when asked what they think about it as an issue, they always say, 62% say yes. Whether that will be enough to swing that vote, we'll see. That's all I can say.
What do you think?
I would imagine there are going to be some people who are seriously spun up on that issue, that it may override the more enduring pocketbook issues that seem to threaten many people in this country. And there's a bit of a disconnect on the pocketbook issues because the so-called urban elites and people like a lot of people in this room that have access to a broad range of investment opportunities are doing real well. Unfortunately, it's even heightened the already pervasive inequality that we have in this country right now. On the other hand, if you're out there working for a living, like a carpenter or something, you don't have very many options where to put your money, and inflation's just been killing you for about 10 years. And so when those people say, when the newspapers, no offense, say, oh, no, inflation's low, things are great. Well, you go talk to an iron worker somewhere, and he's going to say, no, food costs more, education costs more, cars cost more, my rent's gone up, or my house costs more. They're not happy campers. And those are some of the ones, I think, that have pushed this blue-collar ship to Trump.
Just very quickly on what I would say, Dean, the two very quick things. One, obviously, even where there aren't specific abortion measures on the ballot, in some of those states which, for example, already have them, like Michigan, there is some evidence that there are fairly significant numbers of voters, so-called the sort of mythical suburban woman, mythical, but that this has been raised to the level of kind of political mean, but the suburban women voters were very concerned about abortion and what the Republicans might do. So they can make a difference there. The other thing to watch, which I think will be interesting, it's not strictly a swing state, but it's Florida, of course. Florida does have an abortion measure on the ballot. And it is quite interesting, although Trump, I think, won by 7 points quite comfortably. Florida used to be a swing state. We now think of it as pretty solidly a red state. But the polling actually does, remember Ron DeSantis was re-elected governor with 60% of the vote just 2 years ago. But it is interesting, we see that the polling there is close. Again, probably not unlikely to go to Kamala Harris, but the latest polling I've seen has Trump with only about a 4 or 5 point lead in Florida, and there is some political commentary that says that might be to do with the fact that there is this this measure on the ballot which will be very restricted on abortion, and where it was probably expected to go down quite heavily, and might encourage significant numbers of pro-choice voters to come out and vote, and they vote for Harris. So it'll be an interesting thing to see, again, how large that Republican margin is.
Well, yeah, you have to be real careful when you start to break down voters in Florida. It's a much more complex place than many people think. There were over 300,000 more Republican votes in Dade County than ever been cast, and that's how Trump won Florida. And those are the Venezuelans that have migrated and are they're very focused on freedom, like the Cubans. So the continuing impact of more and more Venezuelans in South Florida, overcompensating for the other Latins along the I-4 corridor, that's kind of a game changer, which is turning Florida red again. Then again, there will be people, like we all agree, I think, that are going to have abortion as their main issue, that are going to go to the voting basis of that.
Ambassador Rudy, you mentioned these migrants who are now voting Republican in Florida. But one of the issues facing swing states like Arizona is illegal immigration. Not voters, but people coming across the southern border. And neither the Biden administration nor the Trump administration that preceded it has had an effective solution to addressing the immigration crisis, as some people refer to it. And in fact, there were widespread reports that the immigration bill was in Congress, and in fact, Vice President Harris mentioned this during the debate. The immigration bill that was in Congress was opposed by President Trump, in part because he felt that, or he was accused of wanting to preserve the issue of immigration for the election, although he argued that it was a bad bill. Which was it? Was it a bad bill, Carlos, or was Trump banking on immigration as an issue?
I think that it was a bill that covered a lot of what Republican lawmakers said they wanted, right? I imagine that were it not for the serendipity of an election year, that this is something that could have moved forward. What's interesting when you think about the immigration debate in terms of this election now is how the discussion of immigration has, even though the issues you raise are very salient, it's shifted beyond the border, right? Immigration is about immigrants who are affecting, enriching, complicating, transforming communities around the country, right? The big policy for Trump in 2016 was build the wall. The big policy for Trump now on immigration is mass deportation, right? The wall is about keeping people out. Deportations are about kicking people out, right? He talks about, if the wall is about protecting, now it's about, when you say immigrants are poisoning the blood of the country, it's about purifying the country in some way. It's a real evolution in the way the immigration issue is being discussed in the United States. The interesting thing about it is that I think it's quite obvious that a lot of American voters are ready, even eager for a more orderly, but also more restrictive immigration policy. You can say that's out of xenophobia or just out of a sense of a border in the conditions in which it has been under much of the Biden years, for instance, kind of feels like a country out of control, right? And it could be a very big winning issue for Republicans if they would focus on some of the things that some of them say they want to do, like skills-based immigration, tougher border enforcement, but instead they get in these detours of, Haitian immigrants in Springfield, Ohio, that make their position on immigration feel, not to borrow the idiom of Democrats now, but feel weird, feel extreme in some way. But overall, I think you see a real shifting consensus on immigration policy across both parties. 4 years ago, all the Democratic candidates in the primaries raised their hands and said they wanted to decriminalize border crossings, right? That would not happen. That would not happen today.
So Jerry, does my question mischaracterize President Trump?
A little, I think, yeah. I would say, take issue a little bit with your description that neither Trump nor Biden really dealt with the illegal immigration problem. I mean, that's true in an absolute sense, but if you look at the numbers, in the 3 years after the pandemic, first 3 years of Trump's administration, I think the number of encounters with undocumented people who was about 2 million, maybe 2.5 million. In the first 3 years of the Biden administration, it was 7.5 million. And I don't think there's much question that when Biden came in and immediately undid all of the pandemic and pre-pandemic measures, executive orders that Trump had introduced and sent the signal to the world, hey, America's open, I think that's not surprising that you then got a surge in illegal migration. And second, I would also say, it's not xenophobic to oppose illegal immigration, or indeed to favour restrictions on legal migration. I think that's one of the things that I think Democrats have really been sort of blindsided on in this country, and it's particularly the support among Hispanics for Donald Trump. A lot of people, Democrats, just sort of took Hispanic voters for granted, assumed they would vote. But as you mentioned, Dean, there was a lot of Hispanics, exactly as Ambassador says, the Hispanic vote in Florida is very complex and probably best left alone. But if you look at the results in Texas, along the border in Texas, those key congressional districts, Trump's numbers Trump did better than any Republican has ever done in those cities along the Texas-Mexico border. And the reason is very simple, which is that people who've gone through the legal migration process, I have. I'm an American. I'm very proud American. And my daughter's here too. And she was born here, so she's a native American. She can be president of the United States. I can't, unfortunately. Or you may regard that as fortunate, actually. But when you go through the legal migration process, it's a lengthy, complex, expensive, stressful process to go through legal migration. And when people see other people, coming into the country without being apprehended, being able to work and live and enjoy benefits and all of those other things, and then maybe ultimately one day, getting amnesty, They feel more, it's many of the immigrants who've been through that process who feel most hostile to illegal immigration and most hostile to administrations that do nothing to stop people from coming in legally. So, we need to be very careful. Some of the things that Carl said is right. Some of the language, the ridiculous language that some people use, Donald Trump in particular uses about migrants, is disgusting. But I don't think that should obscure us to the larger fact that a country, it's almost what defines a country to have control of its borders. If you're going to essentially take the position that, anybody can come in, you no longer have cohesion, you no longer have the rule of law. And if you take that approach and you create the kind of disorder that we've seen, particularly kind of in New York City, New York City to some extent, suffering from huge numbers of migrants, many of them with legitimate cases. I'm not saying they don't, but the disorder, the overcrowding, the problems that creates, a country must have the right to decide who comes into its who is allowed to come in legally and become a legal citizen. And I do think that's why so many people are so unhappy with this administration, and why, despite some of his language, so many people are willing to support Donald Trump.
Dianne Pinderhughes?
There is the case that there was a significant negotiation between the parties in the Congress on immigration, and they developed a program, a reform that was ready to be approved. And the Republicans were discouraged from supporting it by Donald Trump. A lot of the issues that you're talking about were, according to the coverage, addressed in that policy. And there was pushback that this should not be done. The other thing I want to say is, it's not as if the immigrants are coming and they're not able to find work. A lot of immigration is a result of people wanting to come and find work, and many businesses need their employment, need their presence. And it's not as if that's something that they're taking jobs from Americans. I mean, that's the general tendency for people to use that argument that this is a problem. There's lots of work that needs to be incorporated, and without immigrant employment would be in great difficulty. And I would argue that's something people tend not to talk about, the ability of the immigrants that are coming to contribute to the American economy. So a combination of what was the policy that was proposed and was negotiated between the Democrats and the Republicans, and the Republicans said, yes, we want it, except Trump said, no, don't do it, because that will affect my ability to win the election. Secondly, what's the role of immigrants in the American economy? If you don't talk about both of those things, it seems to me it's not a fair representation of what's going on.
Can I just add briefly one thing on this topic? Jerry mentioned how sort of onerous and expensive and complicated the naturalization process is. It's also beautiful. It is. I've been living in the United States for decades as a green card holder. I didn't think I had to become a citizen. I finally did it. It was one of the most emotional days of my life, and being surrounded by my family, my friends, and people from all over the world who were in this room in Baltimore with me, swearing in. And if you ever want your faith restored in the American experiment, attend a naturalization ceremony. The other thing I'll say is that we talk a lot about what Latino voters do in Dade County, what Black voters do in North Carolina. I think it's useful to remember that demography is not always destiny. I remember the 2008 election of Barack Obama. I was told that the coalition of the ascendant, this multicultural coalition of voters, were going to, capture the White House for the Democrats in perpetuity. That is not what happened. And even now you see, especially among young male Black and Latino voters, there's a lot of Trump curiosity. Kamala Harris isn't necessarily doing as well, even among those voters, than, say, Joe Biden may have done, just according to polling. So I think it's useful to, in election season in particular, we start slicing and dicing Americans, even more so than we do every other day of the week. And I think it's just good to remember that voter rights are more complex than that.
Well, given what's been said about Venezuelan voters voting Republican and other immigrant groups voting Republican, is it a mistake for Republicans to oppose immigration in any meaningful way?
Yes.
Yes,
Yeah, I think it is. I think that the last person that tried to solve this problem was George Bush in 2007. And a combination of the hardcore right wing and a few labor unions killed it. And it would have called for strengthening the border, both with technology and meat and steel. It would have called for a legal and honest, open and above board process for people to come in, be processed, disclose any problems in their background, and if they were clean, they could come in here and work, and they would have rights, and they would have the opportunity to pursue that dream that Carlos talked about. It would also have tightened up the asylum laws, which had been expanded in many ways by federal courts to accomplish a much broader way of immigration than the original law reads, which you probably read. So if we could have done that, it would have been really good, but we didn't. And now we have the conundrum that the professor mentioned, needing workers drastically. And I'm an employer. There's no employer in this country that couldn't use decent workers. And we have a bunch of them that want to come in here. And by and large, a lot of them are coming from within 600 miles of our border, which means they can get back to their families and things like that. So we should figure some way to harness that. The Biden bill did a lot of good things, no doubt about it. The one thing that bothered me about it, and I don't know if I would have for it or not, I probably would have, is that the limits on how many people could come in per year were still way too high. They're not going to solve the problem. We've got to shut that border down and then let the people in that we can vet in these 2 years. And that would be a lot of them. There's plenty of opportunity for workers in this country.
Yeah, and I think the ambassador is exactly right. On the bill in particular, since I didn't address it, I think although Trump's intervention was as ever politically driven, I'm pretty certain, having spoken to quite a lot of Republicans in Congress, that will not pass the House, precisely because of the point the ambassador raises, which is that the number of the limit, the number of the migration number above which these strict limits will be imposed was still way too high for many Republicans. But again, just sorry to push back again a little bit. I think your question, you said, is it wrong? Does it make any sense for Republicans to be against immigration? I don't think Republicans are against immigration. I don't even think Donald Trump is against immigration. You speak to him, there is he has expanded the number of H-1B visas that were made available when he was president. If you look at his program, as far as you can believe it, he favors quite a significant increase in the number of legal migrants. But it is illegal. It is illegal immigration, and taking tougher measures to oppose it. Again, I'm not defending some of the plans that Donald Trump has, and I'm certainly not defending the language that he uses, but it's that illegal immigration that I think the Republican Party is pretty well unified in clamping down on.
So one of the opponents to prior attempts to control immigration, Ambassador already mentioned labor unions. I'm going to ask a question about labor unions now. The blue wall that put Joe Biden in office in 2020 in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin is also the home of traditional strength of labor unions. Pennsylvania's steelworkers unions, Michigan auto workers unions, and Teamsters. Recently, although the auto workers and steel workers endorsed Vice President Harris, the Teamsters refused to endorse a candidate this time around. In fact, for the first time in decades, didn't endorse a Democratic president. What role are labor unions going to play in this election, particularly if they're not unified behind one candidate? Carlos?
Start with me, very yeah. One thing that just contextually I think that is important to point out is, relatively speaking, the declining power of labor unions in America. Right? When I was a kid, about a quarter of all workers were in unions, now it's maybe 10%. That matters. That's significant. I think a union like the Teamsters was in a bit of a pickle this time around because a lot of its members like Trump. And in fact, the head of the Teamsters union spoke at the RNC. I mean, he says he wasn't invited to speak at the Democratic Convention, he would have, but he didn't. And we normally think of Democrats as typically being closer to labor. But you do have, at least rhetorically, something of a transition in the Republican Party, especially the Senate. It's folks like Josh Hawley, J.D. Vance, speaking in far more sort of pro-labor, economic populist kind of terms, which have scrambled the politics of labor in ways that make it less predictable than it was before. So this is not sort of an area of expertise, but I think that it's one of those areas where sort of the, you can see it in relation to tariff policy, and other things that deal with manufacturing, for instance, where the positions of the party have gotten more, less predictable, more complicated in ways that might give, those unions a little bit more sway in being able to pick and choose their moments.
Dianne Pinderhughes?
I'm a little uncertain about this in the sense that you're right to point out the fact that the Teamsters, for example, didn't take a position on the candidate. Lots of subgroups within the Teamsters have been coming out in support of Harris. Some of them have, that's for sure. In states like Pennsylvania and Michigan, there's no question that it's an important issue for the state as a whole and the electoral college issue. But it might, there are other cross-cutting factors. The role of Palestinians in a state like Michigan. A lot of them voted independent or not. They wouldn't have voted in the primary for the Democratic candidate. So we'll have to see whether the labor issues, the racial, ethnic issues, the ethnic issues in Michigan in particular, cancel each other out, which is a possibility.
Gerard, any thoughts about this?
Yeah, so one thing we should obviously be careful to distinguish between public sector unions, predominantly white-collar public sector unions, and what we used to call sort of blue-collar traditional industrial unions. The white sector unions have been enormously important, obviously, the Democratic Party. Now those public sector unions are still enormously important. Teachers' unions, other public employees' unions raise huge amounts of money, very important in organising, and will continue to be. And secondly, on Carlos's point, and to sort of develop that distinction between blue-collar and white-collar unions. Carlos's point that people like Josh Hawley and J.D. Vance are making much more of an explicit effort at outreach to unions, but also more broadly to working-class voters, reflects simply the dramatic realignment we've seen in sort of demographic trends in terms of voting in this country steadily over the last 20 years, but particularly accelerating in the last 5 or 10 years. When I was a young man and first came to the United States, the unions, working class people were heavily Democratic. They voted Democratic in enormous numbers. They thought of them as representing their economic interests. It was primarily an economic issue. The kind of professional classes, whether in the public sector or the private sector, tended to be conservative, tended to be more likely to vote Republican in very broad terms. In the last 10, 15 years, we've just seen this dramatic flip there now, where more and more working class voters now, as a result of emphasizing cultural issues, issues of identity, issues of national solidarity, are voting, and indeed on some of the social issues, are voting much greater numbers for Republicans. The Democrats are very much the party now of, dare I say it, use a sort of a Marxian term, very much the party of the ruling classes, very much the party of the elites. And again, just look at, for example, if you want the clearest demonstration of that, look at how people vote according to whether or not they've got a college degree. The gap between people with college degrees and without college degrees in their voting behaviour is wider, and it's going to be in 2024, according to all the polls, even wider than it's ever been before, with people with college degrees overwhelmingly voting Democratic and people without college degrees overwhelmingly voting Republican, again, in larger numbers than we've seen even in the last 2 elections. So it's part of, so this issue of unions and what role they play is getting caught up, I think, in this broader political realignment, which I expect will continue. We may see, again, in those northern industrial, those Rust Belt states, as they're called in the election, we may see, as Trump, of course, famously won those states in 2016, and it was the key to his election. And I think, once again, whether or not he wins in those states and is able to pull enough of those working class voters to the polls may determine what happens in November.
So I want to ask, I'm going to switch gears and ask a question about foreign policy. So I'm going to start with the person with ambassador in front of his name. So Ambassador Rooney, the candidates have articulated what I think are distinctive positions on foreign policy. And in particular, President Trump has expressed dissatisfaction or skepticism about our commitments abroad, in particular NATO, our commitment to defend Taiwan in the event of a Chinese invasion, and other American commitments abroad. Vice President Harris, we don't really have a lot of information about her foreign policy positions other than what she articulated during her acceptance speech at the Democratic National Convention, when she talked about Israel's right to defend itself, but to moderate its response in a humanitarian way. What are the things that we should be worried about with regard to foreign policy, depending on who wins this election?
About everything. Just about everything. I mean, the world is a real mess right now. It's kind of been created by some bipartisan poor leadership, quite frankly. And we've shown weakness in the face of heinous authoritarian rulers, like in Iran, like with Maduro in Venezuela. And that only makes them worse than they would have been. And now Iran empowering these Houthis. Saudi Arabia, we tried to get Saudi Arabia to go kill them off, and they couldn't do it. So now we're down there. They shoot a $300 drone at us, and we shoot back with a Patriot missile. We've got to improve the economics of how we're going to take on Houthis. And now you have the Iran-backed activities of Hezbollah and Hamas responding in part to President Trump's very successful effort to bring the moderate Sunni Arab states into a diplomatic relationship with Israel, which drove Iran crazy. And every other Shia, okay? The Shia in Syria, and the Shia in Lebanon. And so, how are we going to deal with that? Well, we have our proxy, Israel. And I do worry that Harris, based on some things she said and her allegiance to Biden, while she's never going to say, I'm not for supporting Israel, that would be political theft. I think she's going to kind of yin and yang a little more, like Biden has, as far as, well, we really can't have innocent people killed. Well, no one wants innocent people killed, but when Hamas and Hezbollah are using the basement of hospitals as their command post, innocent people are going to get killed. And I worked very hard during the war of 2006 to try to make sure that Israel could polish those guys off, Hezbollah, and the Lebanon border. So that's kind of a problem for me, is the Middle East right now. The activity with China, I have to say, I'm not sure any of our leaders know how to deal with China. So we need Ronald Reagan back to deal with China. We talk out of both sides. And then when they do try to do something, right, Biden's tried some things, as did Trump, to do some things with China, they picked the wrong weapons. I'm not a believer in tariffs. They've never worked for anybody in the history of the world. But supply chain realignment, denying China the ability to sell certain things in our country, developing capability to make those things elsewhere, those are real, those are simple, those can be done. And some of the things that we're doing now in some of the bills that Biden, quite frankly, put forth are enabling us to get back in the chip business. So we should be doing that. And the last thing, we've got to have the backbone to fight our large corporations in this country. And I believe in large corporations, okay? But it took Delta and Marriott exactly 1 hour to take down their website that showed Taiwan on it when China raised a formal protest. That's not leadership. companies were beating on both Trump and Biden to have loopholes to the tariffs. So tariffs are going to become a boondoggle for lobbyists to get in there and get their little cubbyhole of an exception. That's another reason I don't like it.
Dianne Pinderhughes, I saw you shaking your head when I was asking my question.
Well, I mean, I can't say anything other than this is an ambassador, and he certainly, my efforts of trying to figure out how to answer your question ended up about the same place. Number one, we're in a lot of difficulties. Some of Trump's assumptions, you didn't mention Putin specifically in your questions, but Trump assumes he's going to settle the Ukraine situation before he's even inaugurated. No, I think that's not a solution. North Korea, you know, he and Kim Jong-un can resume their love affair. You know, it's a real scary situation. There's no easy answer for either of the candidates, I think. But each one of these issues around the Middle East, North Korea, they're all problematic. And the investor said it well, I'll just quote him, that there's been bipartisan poor performance on these issues. They're all in some difficulty. So I agree with him.
Gerard?
Yeah, I don't disagree. Look, I think that the world is in a very troubling state right now. What we really have going on is this de facto or increasingly well-established sort of de jure alliance between China, Russia, Iran in particular, and North Korea. And they are challenging the West's traditional power, the United States, obviously most importantly traditional power, Russia and Ukraine, Iran by supporting the efforts of both Hamas and Hezbollah against Israel, and China continues to challenge, you know, the US and the Asian allies, US-Asian allies in all kinds of ways in the Pacific. And North Korea, meanwhile, is doing its own thing, but also, you know, supplying various of those countries with various weapons. And so far, unfortunately, they're making all the progress. They're making all the running. Russia, you know, we might very much hope that we'll continue to support Ukraine, but I'm not sure that will always win in terms of what Ukraine is trying to achieve, because Russia's strength is just so enormously overwhelming, and we and NATO are not prepared to put our lives, our servicemen and women's lives at risk there. So they're going to get more or less what they want there. I worry about what's happening in the Middle East, especially with so many countries. The mood in Europe is very anti-Israeli right now, and I think Israel is under tremendous pressure. And I do worry a little bit about whether Harris will be as staunch in her support of Israel. And China, again, is, you know, although it's having its economic challenges, is not strategically being significantly challenged by the US. My view about in terms of the difference between the two, and this is, I'm worried about both of them in terms of foreign policy. I think Harris will continue to sort of, with great respect to her, she's not really paid a lot of attention to foreign policy. She's got some good foreign policy advisors around her that I think will be fine. But they will follow a very conventional, you know, the sort of foreign policy that's characterized most of US foreign policy since the end of the Cold War, which is to work with alliances, you know, not really kind of probably face up to the sort of really significant challenges that the US faces. With Trump, it's all personality. You know, it's exactly as the professor said, you know, is he in love with Kim Jong-un? Does he think he can get it? It's all about doing a deal. And I don't think this is the, you know, I don't think doing a deal with Russia over Ukraine, or with China over Taiwan, or with Iran over, which you might even do, over Israel is, you know, is good. So I worry about both candidates. One is too predictably conventional, following policies that really haven't really succeeded in the last 10 years, and the other is just too unpredictable and eccentric. I'll just, well, of course, end by saying, you know, I still have faith that things will turn out right in the end. And, you know, Winston Churchill subscribed to various people, but it's famously Winston Churchill who's supposed to have said, the US can always be relied upon to do the right thing, but only after it's exhausted every other alternative.
Well, as we're running out of time, Carlos, I want to give you the last word on foreign policy.
What to add after this? You know, one interesting thing, to be navel-gazing and get an anchor in what's happening here in November. Polling suggests that Americans give a slight edge to Kamala Harris on matters of foreign policy in terms of, you know, dealing with enemies, with dealing with China, dealing with the wars in Ukraine and the Middle East. That said, voters in swing states give the edge to Trump on those same issues. So it may be that Harris holds an overall advantage and Trump holds the advantage in the places that matter. All I would do is try to think of it in sort of near-term and long-term challenges. The Gaza is right now, right? Russia and Ukraine is right now. Longer term, I think, the question of what kind of world you want to live in, a world where China sets the rules of the road on how the international system functions, on economic and political issues, is less a world I want to live in than one in which the United States attempts to set those rules. I think that challenge is significant. I think Harris might hold a slight edge in at least the willingness to sort of deal with traditional or conventional alliances. Trump's unpredictability is often sold by Republicans as a good thing. Leaders don't know what he's going to do, so they won't get involved. But actually, his susceptibility to flattery, for instance, makes him really rather predictable at times. And so that's part of the difficulty there. Though I worry saying it's sort of too personality based. But in the end, that's what people vote on. People, we can talk about grand theories of foreign policy in the national system. People vote either the party or the person.
Well, with that, I'd like you all to join me in thanking our panel.